Welcome to Taste Buds. I'm Debra Eckerling, goal strategist, writer, and foodie. And today I'm speaking with poet Jehanne Dubrow, who is author of, among other things, Taste, a book of small bites. Welcome, Jehanne. So happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me here today.
I know you're a poet, but we're going to talk about food. So let's do that. And I love the title, well, Taste on Taste Buds, obvious. So tell me about the book. How did it come about? We'll start there.
So, I had written a book of nonfiction called Through Smoke, an essay and notes, which was about how I came to fall in love with the sense of smell and especially with perfume. And the editors of a philosophical series called No Limits, published by Columbia University Press, contacted me and said, "Hey, would you like to write a philosophical meditation on scent?" And, I said to them, "Well, I feel like I've already written my smelly book, uh, but I've been thinking a lot about food and taste. What if I wrote a book that examined philosophically what taste means to us?" And they liked that idea. And so then I had to write a proposal. It was my first time doing that. Um, and for me, often a book comes together once I figure out the form. And so I was thinking, well, how could a book formally reflect the idea of taste? And so I started to think about it as like tapas or matzah, little plates of food, because that's my favorite kind of food to eat. And that was how the book came to be. It's divided into five sections, focusing on the five known tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. And within each of those sections are little tiny essays that are like small bites, focusing on those different tastes. And I wrote the book not in a linear way. I wrote it thinking about just these different chapters, so I would write something having to do with uh, like sweetness in fruit or the saltiness of tears or sweat. And once all those little essays were done, then I started to think about, well, how do I organize them within each of those sections? And the last thing I did actually was write the introduction and the conclusion, which were the parts of the book that scared me the most. I knew that in the introduction, I was going to have to write about the science of taste, and I'm not very good when it comes to science. And I was trying to think, like, how do I explain the science of tastes and taste buds to someone equally as unscientifically minded as I am? And then I knew in the conclusion I was going to write about how does the literal notion of taste transform into metaphor and the ways we speak about taste beyond things that we eat. And that I knew was going to challenge me philosophically because I'm not trained as a philosopher. And in fact, that was the hardest part of the book, was trying to write a book of philosophically minded essays when I'm a poet. But that was actually a wonderful discovery to have in the process, was that, of course, as a poet, I examine philosophical questions all the time.
And as a poet, you need to really tap into those senses
Yeah.
for your other work. So it makes complete sense to me that you wrote this food book. And of course, the author of Taste on Taste Buds with Deb, bite-sized conversation. So we definitely know we speak the same language. What is it about taste that you're like, okay, I did smell, but really what ignited that sense for this collection?
Well, interestingly, taste and scent are linked physically and in terms of how our mind processes information. And taste and scent work together in particular to tap into the part of the brain where we access memory and emotion. And so those are the things I think I love most about taste, that it's so linked to feeling and to a sense of personal identity, that we are so often shaped by the things we've eaten in our lives. And of course, anyone who's thought at all about taste or smell will often think about Marcel Proust, and the story of the Madeleine, which appears at the beginning of his book In Search of Lost Time. And that's a moment in which the main character dips a Madeleine, a cookie, a fan shaped or a shell shaped cookie, into a tisane. And the minute he tastes that cookie dipped in the tea, he's flashed back to a memory from childhood, which lasts the next 50 pages of the book. And we've all had those Proustian experiences where we taste something and instantly we're taken back to a moment that we've forgotten about up until that time. And I love that food can do that. Like so often if you're missing somebody, maybe you'll eat something that reminds you of that person. I'm thinking about my dad, who after my grandmother died, she was a very gifted baker, and like a lot of German Jews of her time, she was sent in preparation for being a good housefrau to Austria to bake, to learn how to bake. And so my grandmother made an incredible Sachertorte, which is sort of the Vienna's most famous cake. It's a dense, rich chocolate cake with layers of apricot jam and a very smooth ganache. And when she died, she left my father the recipe for her Sachertorte, but she didn't leave the recipe for the icing because it was so much a part of her that she didn't need a recipe for the icing. So my father spent the next 10 years trying every chocolate ganache recipe he could find to recreate the perfect icing. And I think it was really because he was trying to recreate that thing that he made for her, um, which he associated with her love. And when he finally found that perfect recipe that almost perfectly recreated the ganache that his mother had made, then the cake was perfect. And in fact, always on my birthday, I asked my father to make me that Sachertorte, because now, of course, I associate it not only with my grandmother who died when I was 8 years old, but with my father's love, and by extension, with her love.
I love that story, and I feel like I feel like you answered the next question, which is what is your earliest or strongest food memory as it relates to taste? Is that it, or is there another one?
I think there's an even earlier one, which is my parents were U.S. diplomats for the first 20 something years of my life, and so I moved every 3 to 4 years my whole childhood. And probably some of the most formative years for me were spent in Poland, which is an interesting place for an American Jew to grow up. And we would frequently, because this was during the height of communism, and the end of the Cold War, um, every 3 to 4 months we would drive to Germany essentially to restock our house with food, because pretty much everything was out of stock in Warsaw. And even though there were food shipments often brought in for Americans, there were just things we couldn't get. And for us, it was always interesting. We would drive. It's only an 8-hour drive, but at the time it seemed like 24 hours. We would drive from Warsaw into West Berlin. And I remember one year we also drove to a second or third cousin of mine who still lived in Munich. Um, and we drove there during the height of it was Easter, and so the whole city was filled with all these German pastries and sweets and desserts. And it was the first time I ever tasted marzipan. And that flavor of the almonds and the crushed sugar molded into all these different sweets for me was a remarkable moment. I think I was probably 5 or 6. And I called Munich Candy City, and for years afterwards, it had this sort of mythical identity in my imagination, because not only did every conditorei and bakery look remarkable with these windows full of desserts, but I remembered the taste of that marzipan as sort of essential, and remarkable. And it wasn't just that it tasted so interesting, but also marzipan has a really interesting texture. It's kind of gritty from the sugar and the crushed almonds. And for some reason, that really struck me as exciting.
Well, if I did not already know you were a poet, I would totally get that you're a poet because your use of words and how you describe things, it's so vivid. Thank you
Well,
for
thank
that.
you.
Do you, and we know you love to eat and smell and taste, but what are your thoughts on cooking?
I I like to cook actually, and the first thing I ever remember cooking was I'm sure I'd helped in the kitchen before then, but I remember one day when I was 14, I came home from school and I decided I was going to cook a full seder, and
Why not?
we were not really we were a very secular family when I was growing up. I think because we were living in all these places where it often was unsafe to be Jewish. And I think my parents thought that they would protect me in some way if they didn't make our Jewish identity too explicit to the outside world. But that also meant in some ways they didn't make it explicit at home. And so I don't know why I came home that day and said, I'm gonna make everything. And my parents came home that night, and there was matzo ball soup, and I'd made haroset, and I'd cooked some kind of salmon, and I'd made all these things. I think I'd made like a delicious eggplant dip, like a Mediterranean eggplant dip, and they sort of looked at me like, "What possessed you?" And I don't know, but I remember that was one of the first moments where I realized. My father always says anyone who can read a cookbook can learn how to cook. Obviously, it depends on the cookbook, but I remember I used all these Molly Katzen recipes because we had so many Molly Katzen cookbooks. And so I made this rather interesting pescatarian, Passover meal, and my parents were just astonished. And so that was the first time I remember really cooking. I find that I have a hard time cooking for one. I'm married, but my husband, for the first 14 years of our marriage, was active duty military, and we hardly lived together because he was frequently deployed. And so I often found it very difficult to cook for myself when it was just me. And I think that partly has to do with the practicality of it. You make too much food and then you get sick and tired of it after day 2 or day 3. But it's also that meals, as I talk about in taste, are a communal experience. So often when we eat, those are the times we share stories, we learn more about one another, um, we learn more about ourselves as well. And so I think it can be really lonely to cook for one. It's probably why there are so many cookbooks about like how do you prepare meals just for yourself. But inherently, I think when we're cooking a meal, we're thinking about not only if we're going to like this thing that we're about to eat, but is the other person or the other people at the are the other people at the table going to enjoy what you've made as well?
So, have you gotten better at cooking for yourself? Or
I
how do you negotiate those 2 fights that 2 parts of you that fight with themselves, the one that loves to cook and the other that is not so keen on eating alone?
Well, fortunately, for now, I don't have to worry about this because my husband has retired from the military and we're actually living in the same house now.
Ooh.
So it's very exciting. But I mean, I do think all of us at some point in our lives have to think about this question, right? Well,
Mhm.
we find ourselves alone for one reason or another, and maybe it is an interesting challenge. See, you're already giving me ideas to write about this. Maybe it
You're
is
welcome.
maybe it is an interesting challenge to think like, how do I find a way to enjoy tasting and enjoy the pleasures of good food when it's just me and I'm all by myself?
Well, you'll have to let me know what comes of this conversation. Do you have a, because I always think it's not nice to talk about food without sharing a recipe. Do you have a recipe that you love that you'd like to share?
Yes, so I think this might be my great contribution to Jewish culture. A few years ago, I came up with a recipe that I call the matzah bromelette. And this is a cross, of course, between an omelet and matzo brie. And it's very, very easy. Depending on the number of people. If it's just for one, you take 2 eggs and mix them together with a little bit of, I use a vegan milk like almond milk, a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, and maybe a spice like an apple pie spice. And you mix them all together, and then in a pan, you use a fat of your choice. I prefer olive oil for that mix of sweet and savory. And when the pan is really hot, you pour the whole thing in as you would an omelet, and you let it sit as you would with an omelet until it's golden on one side, and then flip it. And then when the matzo bromelet is ready, all you do is you can put a little jam on top of it, or a little bit of, I love maple syrup, and it's a delicious combination of sweet and savory. But for me, it tastes sort of more filling and more satisfying than your traditional matzo brie. And you can also make a savory version where you omit the apple pie spice, and then you could put something like salsa on top afterwards, or put it on a bed of arugula and put some kind of dressing on top. So that's my very simple, very weird contribution to American Jewish cooking.
Oh, I love it because it could be breakfast, lunch, or dinner,
Yes, yes.
or both, because it sounds like it's going to end up being huge. Although, at least for me, so one of my favorites is French toast. And I always make extra because I figure, oh, I'll heat it later. And then I'll say, well, it's so good now.
I know. That's what I find with the matzo bromelet is that whatever size I make to fit whatever frying pan I have, it still mostly ends up disappearing in one meal.
Which is fine. It just means that you appreciate your cooking, which I think that's important. I came to love cooking um, later because I always thought it was too much time and energy, and then I realized, all the joy and benefits that come from cooking. So now I went from dialing for dinner to food writer, food podcaster, and whenever I find myself sharing a recipe, I'm like, who's that talking? Is that me? But there's so much joy in the process, whether it is you're cooking for yourself or for others.
Yeah,
Um, and then you get to eat. So I mean, really, what better result than the joy of eating? What better
that's right.
result of the joy of cooking than the joy of eating? Do you have any other cooking tips that you want to share for those who find themselves making solo bromelets, lots of bromelets?
I think whatever, when you're cooking for yourself, sometimes you can become a little, I mean, lonely, of course, but also tired of what you're making. And so I love to take myself out for a meal. And then if I have something that I really love, then try to recreate it, or take one of those tastes that I fell in love with and see if I can incorporate it at home. So for instance, recently, I went to a Turkish restaurant and I loved the pomegranate reduction that they had put on one of the Matzah. And so I went home and thought, well, how can I use a pomegranate reduction? And just thinking in that way about like tastes that you've discovered and ways to incorporate them into your own cooking, even if you're not doing it in the way that you originally encountered this taste, can be reinvigorating, because we're, just as with smell, I think with taste we're always looking for new things to discover, and ways to surprise ourselves, and ways to discover, oh, this is a taste that I didn't know I like, but I'm so glad that it's now part of my repertoire.
Wonderful food for thought. Thank you so much, Jean, for spending time with me. Where can people learn more about you and taste?
Well, I would love if people visited my website, which is jeannedubrow.com. And there you'll find that I've written a lot of books of poems as well as nonfiction. And I hope people will check out my writing.
Well, thank you. I love this aspect and I love that I get to talk to all different types of people because a love of food comes in so many shapes, forms, and sizes. So I love the dive into taste. Any final food for thought?
I would just say, we have so many cool expressions associated with taste. So, for instance, I love the fact that we speak about things being acquired tastes, and we speak about that not just with food, but with everything that we come to associate with discernment. And so, I would say the fact that we have acquired tastes means that we can continue to surprise ourselves and discover and acquire new tastes no matter what age we are. So go to an art exhibit that you wouldn't usually expect to go to, or go see a movie that you wouldn't usually think was one of your tastes, or go taste something, and see if you can acquire a taste for that new flavor.
I, I love it. It's food homework. So not just a recipe, but another way to look at how you explore and bring new flavors into your world. So thank you so much, Jehanne Dubrow, for joining me today. And thank you for tuning into Taste Buds with Deb. Don't miss an episode. You can subscribe on YouTube and or your favorite podcast platform. And you can go to jewishjournal.com/podcast to get recipes like this wonderful one for the Matzah Bromelette, which, by the way, I cannot wait to try. And also read articles that go along with each episode. And you can learn more at tastebudswithdeb.com. So explore, enjoy, because that's really what cooking and taste is all about. Until next time, bon appetit.